Welcome to The Workplace, a podcast by CalChamber. I'm Matthew Roberts, Associate General Counsel for Labor and Employment with the California Chamber of Commerce. Joining me again today on the podcast for the second in a series of podcasts on emotional intelligence is Jen Shirkani. Again, Jen is a nationally recognized expert on emotional intelligence and speaks to national and state conferences on the topic regularly. She is relied upon as an expert for universities, government agencies, and business organizations around the world. Jen is also the author of Ego versus EQ, a book that was nominated for the 2014 USA Best Book Award. In Ego versus EQ, Jen shares strategies for using emotional intelligence, or EQ, as a tool to enhance career advancement and to make organizations stronger. We are so excited Jen is back with us today for a second podcast to discuss the practical applications of emotional intelligence in the workplace. Welcome back, Jen.
Thank you, Matt. Happy to be here.
I am so happy that you are back with us. And on our last podcast, we discussed what emotional intelligence, or as you refer to it, EQ, is and what it is not. For listeners who may have missed our first podcast, or this is the first one of the two that they're tuning into on the subject, can you provide a quick recap of that?
Sure. So EQ is sort of a nickname for emotional intelligence. It's a behavioral science that's been around since the 1980s. And the way I define emotional intelligence is 3 R's. So one is recognizing yourself, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, understanding your moods and how your moods might be affecting the way you're listening or reacting to something. So the second R is reading others and picking up signals other people send, social awareness or situational awareness, if you will, read the room. And the third one is responding appropriately and sort of choosing a response for that person you're with or the setting you're in instead of taking kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. So you're able to have interpersonal adaptability.
Excellent. So then, as we talked about on the last podcast, we talked about a lot of general ideas around EQ, what this will do for your workplace. And today we're back for a practical application of these things, which is amongst my favorite things to do when I do trainings. It's one thing to do the academics, it's another thing to say, look, this is how the real life works with these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about how managers or leaders with a lower EQ might handle a particular situation versus how it might play out with a leader who has a strongly developed EQ?
Sure. So there are a few differences too between EQ and personality, or EQ and communication style as well. So one example is a gentleman I was working with one time, and he was kind of described to me as somebody who was unpredictable or moody at times. So his team never really knew exactly what they were going to get from him. And I met with him first and said, I'm going to interview everybody. What do you think they're going to tell me about your leadership style? And he said, I'm just one of those, I call it like I see it. I'm super direct. And I tell everybody, this is just my communication style. Like I'm not at work to make friends. We're all here to get a job done. And I know that I can sometimes be very blunt or maybe too direct, but I tell my team, listen, if I ever say something that upsets you or offends you, never take it personally, because I don't mean it that way. And I've heard this from many people. This isn't the only person. You probably have too. And I thought, okay, recognize, read, respond. Clearly, this person has the recognition, right? They have the self-awareness to know that they're direct, and they're probably a D on a communication style profile. But the message when they tell people, this is me, this is who I am, is, listen, I'm going to stay in my comfort zone. And if you need to adjust, it's on you.
Right.
Right. In fact, if I do upset you or offend you, you know whose fault it is, right? Because I warned you. I told you not to be so sensitive. And kind of going back to the book title, Ego versus EQ, this to me was like all ego. My comfort zone is more important than your feelings. And so that leader, now a high D on a DISC or communication style, high driving style, high direct style, honestly, that isn't something that changes. That is more like IQ, which is set at a certain age. But with the emotional intelligence, that leader would better know, okay, I'm a high D, which means I'm going to want to say what I think without a lot of softening or filter. But by reading the audience, there may be a couple people on that guy's team that are just like him, that are very direct as well, that are fine if he said, listen, can I just tell you what I'm thinking? And they could have a very frank conversation and it would be fine. But there's probably other people on the team that don't like to be communicated with that way. And so if he as a leader could recognize the burden on himself to do the adjusting instead of asking everyone else to do the adjusting, that is the difference between same, high direct person with or without emotional intelligence.
Well, that's incredible. And it's kind of interesting how that just crosses over generally into workplace conduct. When we talk about codes of conduct or harassment prevention, you'll have people who will joke around, right? They'll say a joke, might be a little off color, and they'll just say, oh, you know what? I was just joking.
Yes.
I'm sorry if I offended you, instead of taking the more proactive step of understanding, when we deal with this conduct, the appropriate thing is to understand what the impact your conduct will have on them, not so much what your intent was. So understanding if I say this joke that might be racist or sexist or something like that even though I mean it as a joke internally, people aren't going to take it that way.
Well, it's even more complicated because you might tell that joke to one person who isn't offended, who thinks it's really funny and has no problem with it. And then you tell the exact same joke in the exact same way to someone else who's running to HR. And so the temptation is, well, it's got to be that person because this other person thought it was hilarious, right? And so it's having the ownership and taking responsibility for, again, reading that audience and having the self-control to know what is an appropriate thing to say and do and what isn't.
So morale, you've kind of touched around the edges on this in the last question. Morale is super important to organizations, right? We talk about productivity and morale go hand in hand. If you like where you are and you want to show up every day and do a good job, you're going to do that. And if you don't like where you are, or you just feel more low about where you are and you're not sure you're where you want to be, you're not going to be as productive. So in the EQ context, how does that impact morale in an organization?
I saw an article that was published, or quote from an article called The State of Moral Leadership in Business. And the quote was that research found that leaders who demonstrate humility are 22 times more likely to inspire trust than those who do not. That humility ends up being...
Yeah, what do you mean by humility, Jen?
Yeah, so I think... so another example, I was coaching a CEO of a large organization, and his leadership style was very formal, very buttoned up. He was, he was always perfect. And I think he always felt like he had to be perfect. He had a really big job. He had a lot of eyes on him, 50,000 employee type company. And we were at one of his all hands meetings, and I was just there as his coach observing the meeting. And I think he had about 50 people in the room. He was up on a stage. He's going through his presentation, which had a bunch of business updates. And I think we were 3 or 4 slides in, and he just suddenly stopped. And he just kind of stood there and looked at everybody. And finally he said, I'm just going to come clean. I left my notes on the bathroom sink next to my watch and my phone. I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing next. I've lost my place. I don't, and he was so embarrassed. Like he was starting to blush, like he just was in confession in a way. And the whole room applauded.
Wow.
And afterward, he's like, what a disaster. I don't even know how I got through that. And I said, are you kidding me? That was the best thing you could have done. You were finally relatable. Like you finally admitted that you did something we've all done. And it was just that moment where everybody could relate, and he finally seemed like somebody like them. And so I think that humility, it's hard to do. It's hard to admit our faults or make fun of ourselves. But that is where that whole ego EQ thing comes in. I always say, take your job really seriously, but try not to take yourself too seriously.
That's awesome. Any other ways in which EQ may impact morale in the organization? The humility thing is great. It's, you are a human as a supervisor, as a leader. You worked hard and you did a lot of things right to get up there, but you are human. So I love that point. Anything else with regards to EQ and morale?
Well, it's interesting because I think as we raise our self-awareness, we better connect to what things bring out the best in us and what things maybe don't. So the higher my self-awareness and even things like knowing what motivates me, motivations change over time. And what motivated me, when I was a 20-something right out of college, my first job or two, is very different than what motivates me now, 25 years later, So I think it's also important to understand, like, what do you want to do with your life? What does bring out the best in you? How do you contribute in a way that's fulfilling so that it fills you up when you're at work? It doesn't just drain you. So we can better pick environments to work in, cultures to work in, managers to work for, the higher our emotional intelligence. And that usually leads to a lot more morale increase because I'm fulfilled by the work I'm doing. I have higher self-actualization, which is another emotional intelligence skill.
Okay, culture, such a huge buzzword, but so important, right? So how can HR professionals bring their organizations along in a culture that actually values EQ, right? Organizations value bottom line, productivity, shareholder value, these kinds of things, but EQ sounds like it's got a lot of value on par with those. So how does an HR professional, somebody who's responsible for managing the workforce, or at least proposing and implementing policies, bring that along that values EQ?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's different for every organization depending on your size and scope. But I think it really has to be role modeled. We have seen one study I thought was really powerful. This came from the American Express Financial Advisor Group, and they selected leaders for a year-long training on emotional intelligence. And they tested everybody at the beginning. So they had a baseline of emotional intelligence, scores in the participant group, but they also tested their direct reports. Then they put the leaders through a 1-year training, didn't give any training to the direct reports, but at the end of the year, retested everybody. And they found that not only did the leaders who went through the training, did their emotional intelligence increase, but so did all of their employees.
Oh, wow.
Just by being led by somebody with higher EI. So the culture benefits when the leaders role model it, and it's actually reciprocal, right? So we're duplicating that investment. When we train a leader, it's actually multiplying our investment dollar because our employees benefit. And that is where you start to really see a culture shift. And of course, rewarding the behavior you want repeated and recognizing and calling people out for that skill is another way to make sure that it's valued in the culture.
And then you talked about earlier motivations, right? What motivates us now is different than what motivated us when we were younger. And we've found that that is kind of an important topic for managing a really stratified workforce by age, right? We're starting to see multiple generations, 4 of them, in the same workforce. But obviously, the younger generations are the ones that are coming up and with more share of the workforce than before. So how will these current and coming generations of workers be impacted by leaders who don't have that higher level of EQ? So if it's not enough to tell businesses, hey, you get more bang for your buck by training a leader in this EQ process to then bring everybody else along, what's going to happen with those workers when they have leaders who don't have that higher level of EQ?
Yeah, it is a legitimate challenge, I think, because Talent Smart, which is another research organization, they have presented data that says that the rates of emotional intelligence are going down by generation. We also have seen IQ scores go down, just FYI. So IQ and EQ are on the decline. And it is a challenge because it's not being formally taught. It's not like students are getting classes on emotional intelligence in elementary or high school. Some get a little bit in college, but not many. And so it really is going to be a huge differentiator. those that can, and there's a lot of resources available today that weren't available 15 years ago or even 20 years ago on this topic. So those that take the initiative to really dive in and learn emotional intelligence or develop it in their team, this will become a big separator in my mind of those that are building success, that are the talent magnets, the employees that everybody wants to have, or the leader everybody wants to work for.
Okay. So for HR professionals, one of the many hats that they wear, of course, is problem solver. Some of the problems that come to them are molehills. Some of them are mountains. How can EQ help them solve these problems and maybe avoid those molehills from becoming a mountain?
Yeah, I think we should really look at it proactively. There's groups that are in chronic conflict, and we always want to give them conflict management training. But I have found with higher emotional intelligence, they have that self-awareness to better understand, like, how is my mood affecting the way I'm listening to this person or how I'm responding to this person. If I have higher self-awareness, I know I'm not perfect, and I know I have areas I need to grow in. So I'm more open to feedback from others. I might take more accountability for my behavior, and I might not be as impulsive, which means I might not get myself into as much trouble by something I've said or done because I'm being smart about the way I react. And so we can see conflict go down with groups as they are proactively talking about emotional intelligence. When they're given feedback, it's not just, hey, your deadlines are off, or you're running late on this, or you're not collaborating well. It's in the language of emotional intelligence. So, one of the pairings I look at is assertiveness and empathy. Those are both emotional intelligence skills. We have to have both, but they need to stay in balance. Too much assertiveness without the empathy. Now I can look like, I'm dominating or bulldogging it. If I have too much empathy without the assertiveness, now I'm somebody that might be taken advantage of or might have a hard time holding a boundary. So it's putting performance feedback in the language of emotional intelligence so people can better understand how to collaborate better, not just that they need to collaborate better.
Makes so much sense. And you just mentioned that nowadays we have so many more resources on this topic than we did 15, 20 years ago. So how do we learn more about this? Just in general, where do we go?
Well, luckily, like I said, there are so many more website and online resources available than there have been ever. There are assessments available, so people can go online and take an assessment and measure their emotional intelligence so they can get a baseline or quantifiable score around it. There is, I mentioned Daniel Goleman and his library of books. He has a whole collection of different topics associated with emotional intelligence contained with a lot of research to go with that. And then our website, which is penumbra.com, I have a resources section, and that we have links there to articles and books and webinars and all kinds of stuff related to this topic. So there's a lot out there. It's really great. And a lot of it's free.
Excellent. Well, Jen, thank you so much for joining me again for part 2 of our emotional intelligence discussion, and especially providing these excellent real life practical examples of how to utilize emotional intelligence in the workplace.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining this discussion on the workplace. If you haven't heard part 1 with Jen, go ahead and check out that episode. And also, please share and subscribe to CalChamber's podcast by visiting calchamber.com.